Madam Chairwoman, if I may, I have a few questions for the Congresswoman from California. The words rolled out in Senator John Kennedy's signature Louisiana drawl, slow and unassuming, like molasses dripping from a jar on a humid summer afternoon. The Senate hearing room, usually a place of dry debates and procedural monotony, suddenly crackled with anticipation. Maxine Waters had arrived that day in a $3,000 designer suit, ready to discuss financial accountability, a sight as ironic as Al Capone rolling up to testify on tax compliance in a gleaming Rolls-Royce. She swept into the room with the unshakable confidence of a veteran who'd been in Congress for over 3 decades, her talking points sharpened like knives: evil banks, greedy corporations, the urgent need for more regulation. She was primed to perform for the cameras, to snag her sound bites for MSNBC, to do what she'd mastered over 33 years, talking a great deal while accomplishing very little. Kennedy, on the other hand, sat at the dais looking like he'd just wandered in from a casual catfish fry back home. His perpetually bemused expression, the one that made opponents underestimate him right before he eviscerated them with facts, was in full effect. His legal pad was scribbled with notes, his southern accent dialed up to its folksy charm, and his reading glasses perched precariously on his nose at an angle that suggested he might need help finding them, even though they were right there on his face. Waters smiled at him, perhaps thinking he was some backwoods lawyer she'd easily bamboozle with big words and righteous indignation. Big mistake. Huge. The hearing began normally enough. Waters was called to discuss banking regulation and oversight, her supposed area of expertise as chair of the House Financial Services Committee. She launched into her prepared remarks, decrying the need to hold financial institutions accountable, to protect consumers, to ensure big banks served the people instead of just themselves. It was a polished speech, one she'd delivered variations of hundreds of times. The righteous indignation was practiced to perfection, the moral outrage queued up flawlessly, the finger-pointing theatrical and commanding. She was in her element, or so she thought. Kennedy listened politely, nodding occasionally, jotting little notes on his pad. He waited patiently until her opening statement concluded, letting the applause from her supporters fade into the ether. Then he leaned into his microphone with that deceptively friendly smile, the one that looks warm until you realize it's the same expression a cat wears right before presenting you with a dead mouse. Congresswoman Waters, that was a beautiful speech, truly moving. You talk about accountability like you invented the concept, which is interesting because I've been doing some research on accountability, specifically on whether you've had any. Waters blinked. That wasn't in the script. I have some questions, Kennedy continued, his drawl making every word sound like it was being served alongside a tall glass of sweet tea. About your finances, your district, your family's very lucrative consulting business, and a bank that got $12 million in bailout money right after you made some phone calls. But before we get to all that, he pulled out a thick folder, landing it on the desk with a thud that echoed through the chamber like a gavel strike. I want to make sure we're using the same definition of accountability, because where I'm from, accountability means you're responsible for your actions. You answer for your conduct. You face consequences when you do wrong. Is that the same definition you're using? Just want to make sure we're speaking the same language before we proceed. Waters' smile had frozen on her face, like someone had hit pause mid-expression. What happened next wasn't a hearing. It was an 8-round prosecution, a Southern fried destruction, a masterclass in dismantling a career politician using nothing but their own record, and that deadly combination of politeness and precision that only hails from Louisiana. Maxine Waters had come to lecture about accountability. She left understanding what it truly meant. And if you think that's hyperbole, wait until you see what Kennedy had in that folder. Kennedy opened the folder with the careful deliberation of someone handling something slightly distasteful, like a biology teacher presenting a dissected frog to a class of squeamish freshmen. Congresswoman, you chair the House Financial Services Committee. That's a powerful position. You oversee banks, regulate financial institutions, control legislation affecting the entire banking industry. It's almost like being able to pick winners and losers. He paused, looking up over his reading glasses, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke from a backyard barbecue. Which brings me to One United Bank. You remember One United, don't you? Waters' jaw tightened slightly. One United is a minority-owned bank that serves your husband's investment portfolio, apparently, Kennedy interrupted gently, his tone still as mild as buttermilk. Let me lay out a timeline for everyone. It's 2008, the financial crisis. Banks are failing left and right. The government creates TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. That's taxpayer money to bail out failing banks. Everyone with me so far? He didn't wait for confirmation, pulling out a document with the flair of a magician revealing his next trick. Now, One United Bank is in trouble. Bad investments, poor management, the usual problems that cause banks to fail. And normally, a small bank like One United wouldn't be on anyone's radar for a bailout. Except for one thing. Kennedy held up the documents so the cameras could capture them clearly. Your husband, Sidney Williams, owned at least $250,000 in One United stock. That's $250,000. And when One United fails, that stock becomes worthless, which would be a real shame for the Williams household finances. He spread out more documents like a poker player revealing a royal flush. So, what happened next is interesting. September 2008. You personally called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson. You, the congresswoman whose husband owns $250,000 in One United stock, called the Treasury Secretary to discuss One United Bank. Then, you arranged a meeting between Treasury officials and One United executives. Kennedy pulled out even more papers, his movements slow and calculated. The Treasury officials later testified they felt the meeting was inappropriate. They said it was unusual. They said it seemed like special treatment. But the meeting happened anyway. And guess what? One United received $12 million in TARP funds, $12 million of taxpayer money. He looked directly at Waters, his eyes steady over the rim of his glasses. Your husband's stock was saved. The bank your family had invested in got bailed out with taxpayer money after you personally intervened. And the House Ethics Committee investigated, Kennedy continued, flipping to another tabbed section. They found that you violated House rules. You brought a matter before the government in which you had a personal financial interest. That's the literal definition of corruption. Waters tried to interrupt, her voice rising. Senator, I was helping a minority-owned bank. Kennedy rolled over her like a Louisiana flood, his politeness unwavering. The Ethics Committee admonished you. That's Washington speak for, we caught you red-handed, but we're not going to actually punish you because you're powerful and connected. You got a slap on the wrist. No fine, no censure, no expulsion. Just don't do it again. And try to be less obvious next time. He leaned back, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. In 2008, when banks were failing and people were losing their homes and their life savings, you used your position as a member of Congress to arrange a $12 million taxpayer-funded bailout for a bank where your husband had invested $250,000. You personally benefited. Your family's finances were protected, and your punishment was being told that was naughty? Kennedy removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly with his tie. Congresswoman, if I owned stock in a bank and used my Senate position to get that bank bailout money, I'd be in federal prison. Martha Stewart went to prison for insider trading involving $45,000. Your family benefited from a $12 million bailout you arranged. But you got admonished? He put his glasses back on, his voice dripping with irony. That's not accountability. That's the opposite of accountability. That's Washington protecting its own. And you're still here. Still chairing the committee that oversees banks, still lecturing people about financial ethics. The irony is so thick, I'm choking on it. Waters's face was red, her composure cracking. I was helping a minority-owned bank serve the community. You were helping your husband's stock portfolio, Kennedy said flatly. The community got $12 million in taxpayer debt. Your husband got to keep his investment, some service. The taxpayers bailed out your family's bad investment, and you call it public service? Ma'am, that's not public service. That's public theft with a better PR strategy. And that was just the opening round. Kennedy had 7 more loaded. Share this. Kennedy pulled out a new section of the folder, this one marked with bright yellow tabs. He looked at it, then at Waters, then back at the folder, as if trying to decide whether to believe what he was reading. Congresswoman, let's talk about your daughter, Karen Waters. She's a consultant, political consulting. Very successful at it, very well paid, which is impressive, considering her only apparent qualification is being your daughter. He pulled out FEC reports, holding them up for emphasis. Karen runs a company that does slate mailers. You know what those are? They're basically flyers that tell voters who to vote for. Any print shop can make them. They cost about $5,000 to $10,000 for a typical campaign. Kennedy set down one report and picked up another, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Your campaign pays Karen's company about $75,000 to $150,000 per election cycle for slate mailers. That's 10 to 15 times the market rate. But it gets better, or worse, depending on whether you're Karen or the donors whose money is going to her. He spread out reports covering multiple election cycles. Since 2004, your campaign has paid Karen over $1.2 million. $1.2 million for services that should cost maybe $100,000 total over that entire period. She's been paid 10 times what the services are worth. Kennedy looked up with exaggerated confusion. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer, but even I can do that math. You're paying your daughter 10 times market rate using donor money and campaign funds. That's quite the family business model. He pulled out more documents, his voice gaining a rhythmic cadence. But it's not just your campaigns. Other politicians pay Karen too. Politicians who want your endorsement. Politicians who need your support. Politicians who understand that the way to Maxine's heart is through Karen's bank account. Kennedy read from a list. In 2020, your campaign paid Karen $250,000. Other campaigns she worked on, all campaigns that received your endorsement, paid her similar amounts. The pattern is clear. Hire Karen, get Maxine's support. Don't hire Karen. Good luck getting Maxine's help. He sat down the list and looked at Waters seriously. Ma'am, you've created a pay-to-play scheme using your daughter as the middlewoman. Politicians who want your support hire your daughter at inflated rates. Your daughter gets rich. You maintain plausible deniability by saying you don't control who hires her. And the political establishment gets to funnel money to your family in exchange for your influence. Waters started to respond, her tone defensive. My daughter provides valuable... Kennedy kept going, his politeness like a velvet glove over an iron fist. The FEC allows family members to work for campaigns. That's legal. But paying them 10 times market rate? That's converting campaign funds for personal family benefit. That's using your political position to enrich your family. And you've been doing it for 20 years. He pulled out one more document. This is an analysis by a campaign finance watchdog group. They calculated that if Karen had been paid market rates for her services, she would have made about $150,000 over the past 20 years. Instead, she's made over $1 million. That's $850,000 in excess payments to your daughter. That's not consulting fees. That's tribute paid to your family for access to your power. Kennedy leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Your daughter charges 15 times what a print shop charges for the same service. The only thing that justifies that premium is her last name. She's not selling consulting services. She's selling access to you, and you're allowing it because your family profits. Congresswoman, you've turned your political position into a family ATM. Your daughter gets rich, you keep power, donors, and taxpayers foot the bill. And you call it legitimate business? Ma'am, the only thing legitimate about it is that you've technically stayed within loopholes that you and your colleagues created to enrich yourselves. 2 rounds in, Waters was getting defensive, but Kennedy was just warming up. Kennedy pulled out a new stack of documents, these ones with charts and statistics clipped to them. He made a show of reviewing them, shaking his head slowly like he was reading a particularly tragic story. Congresswoman, you've represented California's 43rd Congressional District since 1991. That's 33 years, a third of a century, an entire generation. Let's talk about how that district is doing under your leadership. He held up a map for the room to see. California's 43rd includes South Los Angeles, Inglewood, portions of Gardena, and Hawthorne. These are historically African-American communities, working-class families, the people you claim to represent, the people you say you fight for. Kennedy pulled out statistics, his voice steady. In 1991, when you took office, the poverty rate in your district was about 23%. Today, it's 31%. That's not a typo. After 33 years of your representation, poverty has increased by 8 percentage points. More people are poor now than when you started. He read from more data, building the case brick by brick. Median household income in your district, $45,000. Know what the California state average is? $84,000. Your constituents make about half what other Californians make. Crime rate? Among the highest in the state. High school graduation rate? Among the lowest. Homelessness? Exploded under your tenure. Kennedy set down the statistics and pulled out photos, his tone turning somber. But you're not suffering, are you? This is your house. $4.5 million in Hancock Park. Beautiful place. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, pool, the works. Very nice. He held up the photo so everyone could see. Hancock Park. That's one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Average home price about $3 million. It's where old money lives. Gated streets, private security. Not a lot of crime in Hancock Park. Kennedy pulled out a map, pointing emphatically. Here's the interesting part. Hancock Park is not in your district. You represent South Los Angeles, but you don't live there. You live in one of the richest neighborhoods in LA while representing some of the poorest people in California. You drive past homeless encampments on your way from your mansion to your office. He looked at Waters with genuine curiosity. Now, when did you move out of the district? Was it gradual? Did you wake up one day and think, I've done such a great job representing these people that I deserve to live somewhere nicer? Or did you always plan to get rich off the position and move out as soon as you could afford it? Waters tried to speak, but Kennedy held up a hand. His southern charm unwavering. I'm genuinely asking, because I've been a senator for 8 years, and I still live in Louisiana, not in the fancy part, in the same house I lived in before I was elected. I shop at the same grocery stores as my constituents. I see them at church. I live among the people I represent, because that's what representation means." He pointed at the mansion photo again. "But you live in a $4.5 million mansion in a neighborhood your constituents can't even afford to drive through. On a salary of $174,000 a year? You've been in Congress for 33 years. Even with perfect saving and no expenses, you couldn't afford that house on your salary. So where did the money come from?" Kennedy pulled out financial disclosure forms. "Your net worth is estimated between $2 and $6 million. Your salary is $174,000. Your husband is retired. Your daughter is a consultant. But her income is her own. So how did you accumulate millions?" He answered his own question. "Stock trading, speaking fees, book deals, consulting fees, all the ways politicians turn public service into private profit. You've spent 33 years monetizing your congressional seat while your constituents got poorer." Kennedy's voice got harder, cutting through the room like a knife. "You've represented South Los Angeles for 33 years. In that time, poverty increased, crime increased, homelessness exploded, graduation rates dropped. Every single metric of success has gotten worse. But you got richer. You got more powerful. You bought a mansion outside your district." He gathered the statistics back into a pile. "Ma'am, that's not representation. That's extraction. You've extracted wealth from your position while extracting nothing but misery for your constituents. After 33 years, if your district is worse off, that's not bad luck. That's not Republican obstruction. That's not systemic racism. That's your leadership failure." Waters was visibly angry now. "I've fought for my district for decades, and they've gotten poorer while you've gotten richer," Kennedy interrupted. "After 33 years, the results speak for themselves. You don't even live there anymore. You represent South LA from a mansion in Hancock Park. That tells your constituents everything they need to know about your priorities. They're not in Hancock Park. 3 rounds, 3 exposures of corruption. Keep watching. It gets worse." Kennedy's expression changed. This one wasn't about corruption or incompetence. This one was personal, and his voice carried an edge it hadn't had before. "Congresswoman, let's talk about your rhetoric. You're very passionate when you speak. Some might say inflammatory. Some might say you've crossed the line from passionate to dangerous." He pulled out video footage, queuing it up on the monitors. April 2021, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, Derek Chauvin trial. You flew there during the trial, which judges generally don't like, and you spoke to protesters. Here's what you said. The video played, Waters' voice filling the room. "We've got to stay on the street. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure they know we mean business." Kennedy paused the video. "Get more confrontational. That was your advice to protesters during an active trial in a city already on edge. The judge in the case said your comments could cause a mistrial. Let me read his exact words. A congresswoman's statement may place the trial in jeopardy. The judge considered declaring a mistrial because of your rhetoric." He pulled out news reports from that night. "After your comments, protests became more violent. More property damage, more injuries, more chaos. You lit a match and then left. You flew back to California and let Brooklyn Center deal with the fire." Kennedy pulled out older footage. "But that's not your first time inciting people to action. June 2018. Here's what you said about Trump administration officials. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere. He looked up from the transcript. You told people to harass government officials, to create crowds, to make them unwelcome anywhere. And you know what? People listened. Sarah Sanders was kicked out of a restaurant. Mitch McConnell was harassed at his home. Ted Cruz was chased out of a restaurant. You gave permission, and your supporters acted. Kennedy pulled out more examples, his voice steady. You've called for confrontation. You've encouraged harassment. You've used inflammatory language over and over. And when your words lead to violence or harassment, you never apologize. You never take responsibility. You claim First Amendment protection and move on to the next inflammatory statement. He leaned back, his gaze piercing. But here's the double standard. When Donald Trump said, "Fight like hell" on January 6th, you cited an insurrection. You voted to impeach him for his rhetoric. You said words matter. You said leaders are responsible for what their supporters do after hearing their words. Kennedy pointed at her. But when you tell people to get confrontational, that's different. When you tell people to harass mess officials, that's protected speech. When your words lead to violence, that's just passion. Ma'am, you can't have it both ways. Either rhetoric has consequences, or it doesn't. Either leaders are responsible for incitement, or they're not. Waters was shaking her head. I have a right to speak passionately about injustice. You have a right to speak, Kennedy agreed. You don't have a right to incite violence and harassment. When you tell people to get confrontational, and they do, you bear responsibility. When you tell them to harass officials, and they do, that's on you. You can't pretend you don't know that. You're responsible for the consequences of your rhetoric. And so far, you've faced none. 5 rounds. Waters looking rattled. 3 more coming. Share this. Kennedy pulled out appropriations bills, thick legislative documents with sections highlighted in yellow. He opened one to a marked page, squinting at the small print. Congresswoman, you sit on the House Appropriations Committee. That's where spending bills originate. That's where earmarks get added. That's where taxpayer money gets directed to specific projects. Very powerful position. Lots of opportunity for, let's call it, creative spending. He looked up over his reading glasses. Let's talk about where some of that money goes. Specifically, let's talk about organizations in your district that receive federal funds and then, coincidentally, hire your daughter. Kennedy pulled out a flow chart, holding it up. I made a diagram because I'm a visual learner. Here's how it works. Step 1. You direct a federal earmark to a community organization. Step 2. That organization hires Karen Waters as a consultant. Step 3. Karen gets paid, often with the federal funds you appropriated. Step 4. The organization and its leaders donate to your campaign. Step 5. Repeat. He pointed to specific examples on the chart. 2019. You secured a $1 million earmark for a South LA community development organization. 3 months later, that organization hired Karen for $75,000 in consulting fees. 6 months after that, the organization's board members and their families maxed out donations to your campaign, total $48,000. Kennedy moved to another example. 2020, $500,000 earmark to a housing nonprofit in your district. 2 months later, Karen's company gets a contract for $90,000. 4 months later, the nonprofit's executives and their relatives donate to your campaign. Interesting pattern, isn't it? He pulled out more examples. 2021. $300,000 to a job training program. Karen gets $60,000 in consulting fees. Campaign donations follow. 2022. $400,000 to a youth services organization. Karen gets $50,000 more donations. Over and over, the same pattern. Kennedy set down the flowchart and pulled out accounting records. The FBI could investigate this as money laundering. Here's why. Taxpayer funds are appropriated by you. Those funds go to organizations. Those organizations pay your daughter at above-market rates. Those organizations then give money back to you via campaign donations. The taxpayer money goes in a circle, from treasury to organization to your daughter to you. Everyone wins, except the taxpayers who funded it. He looked at Waters seriously. Now, ma'am, you've created a money laundering scheme using federal appropriations. It's legal, technically, because you've written the rules to allow it. But legal and ethical aren't the same thing. You're taking taxpayer money, routing it through nonprofits to your daughter, and getting campaign donations in return. That's corruption by any reasonable definition. Waters tried to defend herself. These are legitimate community organizations doing important work that hire your daughter at inflated rates after you give them federal money, Kennedy interrupted. Congresswoman, here's the test. Would these organizations hire Karen if you weren't their congresswoman? Would they pay her $90,000 for consulting if you hadn't just secured them $1 million earmark? Or is hiring Karen the price of admission for getting your support? He leaned forward. You've turned federal appropriations into a family enrichment program. Taxpayer money flows to your district. A cut goes to your daughter. Donations flow back to your campaign. And you call it community service? But the community isn't being served. Your family is. You've privatized the profits and socialized the costs. Taxpayers fund it. Your daughter profits, and your constituents see no real benefit. Kennedy pulled out one more document. This is an analysis by a government watchdog group. They tracked every federal earmark you've secured over the past 10 years and cross-referenced it with your daughter's client list. Guess what? 63% of organizations that received your earmarks hired Karen within the following year. 63%. That's not coincidence. That's a system. He set it down with finality. You've institutionalized corruption. You've made it a system, a process, a business model. And because it's technically legal, you face no consequences. But the American people see what you're doing. They understand that you've turned public service into family profit, and they're tired of it. 6 investigations into corruption, 2 more rounds. Comment if you're still watching. Kennedy's expression turned quizzical as he pulled out what looked like a textbook, a basic economics primer. He opened it to a bookmarked page, read for a moment, then looked at Waters with exaggerated confusion. Congresswoman, you chair the House Financial Services Committee. You regulate banks, oversee the Federal Reserve, control financial legislation affecting trillions of dollars. So I assume you understand basic economics and banking principles. He closed the textbook. Let's test that assumption. I'm going to ask you some simple questions. Not trick questions, just basic concepts that anyone regulating the financial system should know. Kennedy pulled out his legal pad. First question. What is the current federal funds rate? Just approximately. You don't need to be exact. Waters blinked. The federal funds rate is, it's set by the Federal Reserve to control. Kennedy waited. Waters trailed off. You don't know, Kennedy said. It wasn't a question. The single most important interest rate in the American economy, the rate that affects every other rate, and you don't know what it is. Okay, let's try an easier one. He made a note. Can you explain quantitative easing? What is it and how does it work? Waters straightened. Quantitative easing is when the Federal Reserve purchases assets to stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates. Kennedy nodded. That's the textbook definition. Now, explain how it actually works. What assets? How does buying them increase money supply? What are the risks? Silence. You memorized a definition but don't understand the mechanism, Kennedy observed. Let's try another one. What's the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy? Waters gave a vague answer about government spending and Fed policy. Kennedy pressed for details. She couldn't provide them. Congresswoman, these aren't complex questions. These are fundamentals. You've been on the Financial Services Committee for 30 years. You've been the chair since 2019. You regulate the most complex financial system in the world. Yet you can't explain basic concepts that any economics undergraduate should know. Kennedy pulled out video footage of Waters questioning bank CEOs during committee hearings. Let's watch some of your questioning. This is you asking J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon about student loans. The video played. Waters asked a question based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how bank capital requirements work. Dimon politely tried to explain. Waters talked over him, clearly not understanding his answer. Kennedy paused it. You asked a question that showed you don't understand bank capital ratios. Jamie Dimon tried to educate you. You ignored him because you didn't understand his answer. That's dangerous, ma'am. You're regulating industries you don't understand. He played more clips. Waters confusing concepts, asking questions based on false premises, making statements that revealed gaps in knowledge. Each time the bank CEOs or Fed officials tried to politely correct her. Each time she plowed ahead regardless. Here's what concerns me, Kennedy said, stopping the video. You've held this position for years. You have staff who should be educating you. You have access to experts. Yet you don't seem to have learned the basics. Why? He answered his own question. Because you don't need to understand the subject to wield power over it. You can regulate industries you don't comprehend because your power comes from seniority, not expertise. You've been there long enough that you chair the committee by default, regardless of whether you're qualified. Kennedy pulled out more examples. You've made policy recommendations that economists across the political spectrum say are nonsensical. You've proposed regulations that show fundamental misunderstandings of how markets work. You've questioned Fed officials about things you clearly don't grasp. And you've done all this while controlling legislation that affects trillions of dollars and millions of jobs. He looked at her seriously. Congresswoman, you're steering a ship you don't know how to sail. You're regulating industries you don't understand. You're making policy affecting the entire economy without grasping basic principles. That's not just incompetence. That's dangerous. People's livelihoods depend on you knowing what you're doing, and you clearly don't. Waters was angry now. I don't need to know every technical detail to provide oversight. Yes, you do. Kennedy's voice rose for the first time. You're the chairman. If you don't understand how banks work, how can you regulate them effectively? If you don't understand monetary policy, how can you oversee the Fed? If you don't grasp basic economics, how can you write financial legislation? He stood up, gathering his papers. You've held this position for years through seniority, not merit. You've wielded power you're not qualified to have. You've made policy affecting millions of people without understanding the consequences. And you've done it all while enriching yourself and your family. That's not leadership. That's a con job that's lasted 33 years. 7 rounds of exposure. One final devastating round coming. Kennedy stood at his position, gathering all the documents he'd presented into one kinder comprehensive pile. It was several inches thick, the accumulated evidence of 3 decades of corruption, incompetence, and self-dealing. He placed his hand on top of it like a lawyer resting his hand on a Bible before taking an oath. Congresswoman Waters, let's review your career. I want to make sure I haven't missed anything important. He pulled out a timeline, unrolling it so the cameras could see. 1991. You're elected to Congress. You're going to represent South Los Angeles, one of America's poorest communities. You promised to fight for them, to be their voice, to make their lives better. How'd that work out? Kennedy walked along the timeline, pointing. 1991 to 2024, 33 years. Let's look at the results. Poverty in your district increased from 23% to 31%. Median income dropped from 60% of the California average to 53%. Crime increased by 47%. High school graduation rate dropped by 11 points. Homelessness exploded by 600%. He looked up. By every measurable metric, your district is worse off now than when you started. Every single one: education, income, crime, poverty, homelessness, all worse. You've been their representative for a third of a century, and they're worse off. Kennedy moved to a different section of the timeline. But you're not worse off. Let's look at your personal trajectory. 91. You're a middle-class woman. By 2000, you're worth about $500,000. By 2010, you're a millionaire. By 2020, you're worth over $4 million. Your net worth has increased 8-fold while your constituents got poorer. Funny how that works. He pulled out the photo of her mansion again. And you bought this, $4.5 million outside your district, in one of LA's wealthiest neighborhoods, while the people you represent live in poverty. You live in luxury while they deal with crime and homelessness. You live behind gates with security. Kennedy moved to another section. Let's talk about your family. Your daughter Karen has made over $1.2 million from your campaigns and from organizations that receive your earmarks. Your husband's investment in One United Bank was saved by a $12 million bailout you arranged. Your family has profited immensely from your position. They're much better off than they were in 1991. He pulled out the ethics violations. House Ethics Committee has investigated you multiple times. One United Bank violated House rules. Campaign finance, multiple complaints. Earmark abuses, documented but unpunished. You've been admonished but faced no real consequences. You've violated ethics rules repeatedly and remained in power. Kennedy pulled out legislative records. Your legislative accomplishments? Minimal. Bills you've passed to help your district? Essentially zero. Major legislation with your name on it? None. What have you actually accomplished in 33 years besides enriching yourself and your family? He pulled out media appearances. But you've made time for TV, hundreds of cable news appearances, thousands of tweets, countless press conferences. You've built a media brand as a fighter, a resistor, a voice for the voiceless. But when we look at actual results, the voiceless are still voiceless. They're just poorer now. Kennedy pulled out the incitement footage. You've used inflammatory rhetoric that's led to violence. You've told people to get confrontational. You've encouraged harassment of officials. You've incited action without taking responsibility for consequences. And you've never apologized. He pulled out the financial ignorance examples. You chair the Financial Services Committee despite not understanding basic economics. You regulate industries you can't comprehend. You ask questions that reveal fundamental gaps in knowledge. You wield power you're not qualified to have. Kennedy gathered everything back into the pile, standing directly in front of Waters. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, 33 years in Congress. Your district is worse off by every metric. Your family is richer by millions. You live in a mansion outside your district. You've violated ethics rules repeatedly. You've enriched your family using your position. You've incited violence with your rhetoric. You don't understand the industries you regulate. You've accomplished nothing legislatively except maintaining your own power. His voice was quiet, but carried throughout the silent chamber. You represent everything wrong with career politicians in Washington. You've turned public service into private profit. You've extracted wealth from your position, while your constituents extracted nothing but more poverty. You've held power for 3 decades without delivering results. You've enriched your family, while families in your district struggle. Kennedy picked up the entire pile of evidence. This is 33 years of corruption, incompetence, and self-dealing, documented in official records, FEC filings, ethics reports, legislative records, and public statements. Every claim I've made today is backed by evidence. Every accusation is proven by your own conduct. He set it back down. The question isn't whether you've been a corrupt, ineffective representative. The evidence proves you have been. The question is, will you finally be held accountable? Will you face consequences for violating ethics rules? Will you face primary challenges from constituents who are tired of being represented by someone who doesn't live among them or understand them? Kennedy looked at the camera. Or will you stay in power, keep enriching your family, keep living in your mansion, keep failing your constituents, and keep facing no consequences, because that's been the pattern for 33 years? And based on history, that pattern will continue until the voters of South Los Angeles decide they deserve better. He turned back to Waters. After 33 years, Congresswoman, if your district is worse off, that's not bad luck. That's not Republican obstruction. That's not systemic anything. That's your leadership failure. You've had 33 years. The results speak for themselves. Your constituents are poorer. You're richer. They suffer. You prosper. That's not representation. That's a con that's lasted 3 decades. Kennedy sat down, folded his hands. I have no more questions. I think the evidence speaks for itself. The room sat in stunned silence. Waters looked like she'd been hit by a truck, her attorneys frantically whispering, Democrats on the committee staring at their desks, Republicans trying not to smile. And somewhere in South Los Angeles, Waters' constituents were watching, wondering why it took a senator from Louisiana to say what they'd been thinking for years. The video went viral before the hearing had even ended. Staffers were texting clips. Media was rushing to cover it. Social media was exploding. Kennedy destroys Maxine Waters was trending worldwide within an hour. By the next morning, the video had 80 million views across all platforms, not clips. The full 2-hour hearing. People were watching the whole thing. Kennedy's methodical destruction of Waters' career playing out like a legal drama. Each round building on the last. Each piece of evidence more damning than the one before. CNN tried to frame it as a partisan attack, but their own legal analysts had to admit the evidence is solid. Senator Kennedy presented documentation for every claim. One analyst said reluctantly, "These aren't allegations. These are documented facts from public records." MSNBC brought on defenders of Waters. but they struggled. How do you defend someone living in a $4.5 million mansion while their district suffers in poverty? How do you explain away a daughter making 10 times market rate from the mother's campaigns? How do you justify a district getting worse over 33 years? Even liberal outlets couldn't fully defend her. The Washington Post ran a fact check. Kennedy's claims about Waters' district, family enrichment, and ethics violations are largely accurate. Largely accurate was the best they could do. The real impact came in her district. Within 48 hours, protests erupted outside her Los Angeles office. Not small protests, hundreds of people, including many of her own constituents. Signs read, "33 years of failure. Move back to South LA. Our poverty, your mansion." Fire Maxine. A community activist who'd supported Waters for years gave an interview. "We've been loyal to her for decades. We defended her when Republicans attacked her. But Senator Kennedy laid out facts we can't ignore. She doesn't live here anymore. She's gotten rich while we've gotten poorer. Her daughter makes millions from campaigns. We can't defend this anymore." The House Ethics Committee, which had been sitting on complaints against Waters for years, suddenly announced a new investigation, under pressure from the viral video and public outrage. They couldn't ignore it anymore. They'd review the one united matter, the family enrichment, the earmark patterns, everything Kennedy had documented. More significantly, a primary challenger emerged within a week. A young progressive Democrat from South LA announced she'd challenge Waters. Her entire campaign was built on Kennedy's presentation. 33 years of failure. Time for new leadership that lives in the district, understands the district, and will fight for the district. The polls were devastating for Waters. In her own district, her approval dropped to 47%. For the first time in decades, she was underwater with her own constituents. When asked if they'd prefer new leadership, 61% said yes. Her fellow Congressional Black Caucus members distanced themselves. They couldn't be seen defending corruption, especially corruption so thoroughly documented. Some privately said what they couldn't say publicly. Kennedy was right. Waters had been getting away with it for too long. The appropriations she'd controlled started drying up. Organizations that had hired Karen suddenly announced they were going in a different direction with their consulting. The pay-to-play scheme Kennedy exposed had become too hot to touch. Karen Waters' consulting business collapsed. Organizations that had paid her inflated fees stopped calling. Politicians who'd hired her to get Maxine's endorsement found other consultants. The money pipeline Kennedy documented shut down almost overnight. Waters herself became toxic. Speaking fees disappeared. Organizations that had paid her $20,000 per speech found other speakers. The media appearances she'd craved became scarce. Networks didn't want to give airtime to someone who'd just been exposed so thoroughly. But perhaps the most symbolic moment came 3 months after the hearing. A for sale sign went up outside her Hancock Park mansion. She was selling. The speculation was that she couldn't afford it anymore without the consulting fees to Karen, and with her political career in jeopardy. Or maybe she finally got the message that living in luxury while representing poverty was indefensible. Either way, the mansion that symbolized her disconnect from constituents was going on the market. Kennedy's point had hit home. The primary election 6 months later wasn't even close. Waters lost by 19 points, 19, to a challenger who'd never held office, who had 1/10 of Waters' campaign money, who had none of her name recognition. But that challenger had something Waters didn't. She lived in the district, understood the district, and hadn't spent 33 years enriching herself while constituents suffered. On election night, Waters gave a bitter concession speech. She blamed Republicans, blamed racism, blamed outside interference. She never once acknowledged what Kennedy had documented, that she'd failed her constituents for 3 decades while enriching herself and her family. Kennedy, asked about it during a press conference, was characteristically modest. "I just asked questions and presented facts from public records." If that's controversial, if that's considered a partisan attack, maybe the problem isn't the questions. Maybe the problem is the conduct. Someone asked if he felt responsible for ending her career. Kennedy smiled that Louisiana smile. "I didn't end her career. Her record ended her career. I just made sure people saw it. All I did was shine a light. The roaches scattered when the light came on. That's not my fault. That's their nature." The hearing became required viewing in political science classes. The Kennedy-Waters hearing was analyzed for its effectiveness, its use of evidence, its methodical structure. Professors used it to teach students about accountability, about how to present evidence, about the importance of documentation. But for ordinary Americans, especially those over 60 who'd watched career politicians enrich themselves for decades, it was simpler than that. They'd watched a Louisiana lawyer with a slow drawl systematically destroy a career politician with her own record. No tricks, no spin, just facts and receipts. Maxine Waters had spent 33 years building power, accumulating wealth, and avoiding accountability. It took John Kennedy one hearing to bring it all down, because he'd done something radical in modern politics. He'd held a powerful person accountable using evidence and facts. The message echoed far beyond that hearing room. Career politicians who enrich themselves while constituents suffer, who violate ethics rules without consequences, who hold power through seniority rather than merit, their time was running out. Someone was watching. Someone was documenting. Someone had receipts. And sometimes that someone has a Louisiana drawl and a legal pad full of evidence. Senator Kennedy did what journalists should have done decades ago. He investigated Maxine Waters and presented the evidence of her corruption and incompetence in a way that couldn't be ignored or spun away. 33 years of enriching herself while constituents suffered. $1 million to her daughter from campaign funds. Ethics violations for helping her husband's bank. A mansion outside her district while constituents live in poverty. Inflammatory rhetoric that incites violence. Fundamental ignorance about the industries she regulates. Family enrichment schemes funded by taxpayers. Kennedy exposed it all, with that Louisiana charm and those devastating receipts. He didn't yell. He didn't insult. He just presented fact after fact, document after document, showing exactly who Maxine Waters is and what she's done with 33 years. Here's teams in power. Share this with everyone tired of career politicians who get rich while Americans get poor. Comment below. After 33 years of failure, did Maxine Waters deserve to lose her seat? Because her constituents finally got the representation they deserve, someone who actually represents them instead of exploiting them. The receipts don't lie. Kennedy brought all of them. And career politicians everywhere are nervous, wondering if they're next. Because if someone digs into their records the way Kennedy dug into Waters's, what will they find? Probably exactly what Kennedy found in that folder. Decades of corruption that thrived in darkness until someone finally turned on the light.